Welcome to my channel, a place where every mystery hides a story, and every story hides a truth. In the midst of forgotten streets, footsteps echo through the silence, and the faint glow of a lamp guards secrets that refuse to die. Every clue matters. A torn letter, a fading footprint, even the sound of a clock ticking in the dark. Here, doubt becomes a puzzle, and puzzles lead us to the heart of the unknown. So prepare your mind, watch closely, and listen carefully, because the shadows are speaking, and the truth is waiting to be found. This is where every case begins. Welcome to my channel. Asterisk.
It was in the grey-hearted lull of a rain-swept October that the singular affair of the clock first cast its long shadow upon Baker Street. I recall with vivid detail the atmosphere of that dreary evening firelight flickering across Holmes' angular features as he sprawled listlessly in the armchair, his violin lying untouched at his feet, and the Times abandoned beside the tea tray, whose contents had long gone cold. There was in the air a curious weight, a hush that felt not unlike the calm preceding a storm. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, his voice slicing through the silence, "have you ever considered how the most innocuous of objects can become the herald of deepest intrigue?" I looked up from my notes, for I had been reviewing the details of our recent encounter with the forger, Langley Pike, and found Holmes staring not at me, but at a peculiar object resting on the far shelf, a clock. More precisely, a rather ordinary-looking carriage clock of polished brass and glass casing, the kind one might find on the desk of a modest clerk or in the drawing-room of a retired colonel. "I confess," I said, "that I find it no more curious than your collection of Persian tobacco pouches or the petrified toad you keep in the cabinet." Holmes gave a dry chuckle and folded his long fingers beneath his chin. "Watson, is precisely why it interests me." He rose and walked over to the shelf. Lifting the clock with an air of studied care, I noticed for the first time a strange patina upon its surface, teeny flecks of corrosion about the handle, and the faintest impression of a fingerprint on the glass. It had not been there that morning. I was certain of it. "You brought that home today?" I asked. Tot Holmes nodded. "Or rather, it followed me." "Followed you?" He returned to his chair with the clock in hand, placing it between us like a silent guest at our evening fireside. I had been walking along Upper Swandam Lane, indulging in the perverse pleasure of observing human vice in its more honest forms, when a child ran up to me, no more than 6 years old, dirty-faced, clutching this very clock in his arms. He said not a word, Watson, only looked at me, placed it in my hands, and ran off before I could detain him. "That's unusual." "To be sure," I said, now taking in the clock with new eyes. "Unusual," Holmes echoed. "It is bizarre. Note the dial. The hands are stopped at 11:47, yet the mechanism, when wound, functions perfectly." I leaned forward and watched as Holmes turned the key at the back of the case. The gears within began to tick, but the hands remained frozen. "And listen." He held the clock to my ear. A steady rhythm, unmistakably mechanical, but with a curious undertone, a second beat, almost like a whisper behind the tick, 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 faint, maddening, as if something inside wished not to tell the time, but to speak. Holmes snapped the mechanism shut. "You know me, Watson. I am no romantic, but there is something about this object that offends logic, and when logic is offended, the world has usually begun to lie." We were interrupted then by the brisk knock of Mrs. Hudson. She entered carrying a note on a silver tray. "For you, Mr. Holmes, delivered by hand not a minute ago." Holmes opened it. His expression darkened at once. He handed it to me without a word. The paper was stiff, thick with age. In a script that bore the tremor of distress, the note read, "Do not keep the clock. It has already taken one life. The second will follow before midnight." "A friend." I looked up at Holmes, my pulse quickening. "Well," he said, rising with sudden energy, "we must earn our supper this evening. The game, it seems, is not only afoot but ticking." He reached for his coat. "Where are we going?" I asked, already pulling on my boots. "To discover whether this clock tells the time or tells a story of murder." And with that, we stepped into the mist-choked streets of London, the brass clock wrapped beneath Holmes' arm like a secret waiting to awaken. Little did we know then that this harmless artifact, with its stopped hands and its phantom chime, would unravel a tale of revenge buried in time's shadow, a tale that would test Holmes' reason and my courage as no other had before. The clock had followed him home, but it was we who would follow it into the heart of a mystery far older than its gears. Chapter 2. The Whisper. Beneath the gears, our destination that night was not one Holmes revealed outright, but rather a puzzle unto itself. He led us in a meandering path across rain-slicked pavements and fog-draped alleys, the street lamps flickering like uncertain candles above a crypt. The weight of the brass clock under his coat gave our errand a sense of ceremonial gravity, as though we were not pursuing a case, but transporting a relic to its judgment. "Holmes," I said, as we turned onto Fleet Lane, "do you intend to take this to Scotland Yard?" He gave a low murmur of amusement. Were the Yard inclined to concern itself with haunted timepieces and anonymous notes, we'd be poorer for mystery, and the Yard richer for embarrassment. No, Watson, our course leads elsewhere. It soon became clear that Holmes was not merely walking but observing. His gaze flitted from windows to doorsteps, from the hands of loitering men to the flicker of curtains on upper floors. He paused twice, once to study a carriage whose driver seemed to engrossed in the gutter for a man without coin, and again before a newsagent's window where the evening edition had run with a curious headline, "Clockmaker found dead in shop." No sign of struggle. Holmes said nothing, but his eyes narrowed. He purchased the paper with a coin, folded it precisely, and tucked it into his coat. We continued without a word. Eventually we arrived at a narrow shop front in Clerkenwell, the windows dusty and dark, the sign overhead barely legible in the gaslight. Graves and Sons, Horologists. A single brass bell hung beside the door, so faint and polished it seemed forgotten by time itself. Holmes rapped gently on the door with his knuckles, then waited, as if expecting the house to answer of its own accord. When no reply came, he turned the knob. It yielded with ease. We stepped into a room that was part workshop, part mausoleum. The air was heavy with the scent of oil, dust, and old mahogany. All around us, clocks of every shape and size lined the walls, some upright like sentinels, others suspended in mid, their pendulums motionless, but not silent. One Claconi one was ticking, the same rhythm as the one Holmes carried. He set the carriage clock gently on the central work table. The ticking inside it now seemed louder, more insistent in the stillness of the room. "We are not alone," Holmes said softly. Before I could ask what he meant, there came a sound from behind the partition curtain, a dragging noise, slow and wet, as though something inhuman were attempting to cross the floor. Holmes motioned for silence. He stepped forward and swept aside the curtain. There was no monstrous intruder, but a man collapsed, breathing heavily, one hand clutching at his waistcoat. He was of late middle age, pale as wax, and wore an apron stained with grease and ink. His eyes opened sluggishly as Holmes knelt beside him. "Name?" Holmes demanded, gently but firmly. The man coughed once, then rasped, "Hargrave, Elias Hargrave." Holmes motioned for me to examine him. I did so at once, checking pulse, eyes, and temperature. The man was not dying, but close to collapse from exhaustion. "Perhaps shock." "Holmes," I said, "he's in no state for questions. He needs warmth and rest." Holmes stood. "Then we must act quickly before rest robs him of memory." He returned to the work table and held up the carriage clock. "Mr. Hargrave, do you know this object?" The man blinked. Then, with visible effort, he nodded. "It's one of mine, but not mine. I never sold it. You made it, helped make it, modified it, but it was taken." Holmes' eyes sparked. "Stolen?" "No." Hargrave coughed again. "It was bought, but under false name. I should have known. The commission was strange, too precise, a clock with two separate escapements, chiming discordant intervals. Why build such a thing? What was the buyer's name?" Holmes asked. The man whispered a name so faint, I barely caught it. "Grigsby." Holmes stilled. "Grigsby." Hargrave nodded. "Yes, 2 years ago. Said he wanted to give it as a gift. But when I heard what happened to the other horologist, Mr. Fellowes, I knew." "Knew what?" "That the clock, it wasn't a gift. It was a message." Holmes leaned forward. "What sort of message?" Hargrave's breath came fast, now verging on panic. "He's using them, using clocks as warnings, each one built to mark an enemy." A gust of wind rattled the window panes. Holmes stood motionless, his eyes distant, as if reaching into a past not yet spoken aloud. "I believe," he said at last, "that we are walking backwards into a vendetta." I looked down at the brass clock, still ticking steadily on the table, its hands stubbornly fixed at 11:47. "Holmes," I said slowly, "if this clock was meant for you, "Then, are you the next name on Grigsby's list?" Holmes gave me a rare, grim smile. "Or perhaps the last." With that, he extinguished the lantern and ushered us into the fog-bound street once more. The night was darker now, and the ticking, it seemed, followed us still. Chapter 3. The name that should have stayed forgotten. The mist lay heavy upon the rooftops as we returned to Baker Street. Our steps were slower now, laden with questions we dared not answer aloud. Holmes was silent for most of the walk, the collar of his coat turned up against the drizzle, his mind, I could tell, spiraling inward like the delicate gears of the clock we had left behind in Hargrave's darkened shop. Only once did he speak, and, even then, it was as if to himself. "Grigsby," he murmured. "Not a name I expected to hear again. Not after so many years, you know him?" I asked, peering sidelong through the murk. Holmes did not answer directly, but his jaw tightened, and I knew better than to press. When Holmes chose to delay an explanation, it was not from forgetfulness, but because the truth had not yet finished maturing in his mind. Once inside, Holmes stoked the fire with sudden intensity and pulled from his shelf a narrow, dust-covered volume registry of civil prosecutions, 1872 to 1885. He opened it to a page already marked, with a thin sliver of paper. "Watson," he said, without looking up, "do you recall the affair of the Minton bonds?" I searched my memory. Faintly. Wasn't that the case of the forger who vanished before trial? Vanished, yes, but not before taking with him a clerk's pension, to invest his fortunes, and the marriage prospects of a baronet's daughter. His name, officially, was Edwin Gable. He turned the book and showed me a grainy courtroom sketch. "But Holmes," I said. "That man doesn't resemble." "Indeed," Holmes interrupted, "because the man who stood trial was not Gable. He was a front-hand actor of sorts. The true mind behind the scheme operated in the shadows, using aliases and paid intermediaries. One of those names, rarely mentioned even in court proceedings, was Grigsby." I stared at the sketch. "Then this Grigsby, he was never caught." Holmes snapped the book shut. "He was never even seen, and yet I suspect he saw us." He stood, crossed to the window, and drew back the curtain. The street below was quiet. A hansom rolled slowly past, its driver glancing once toward the flat before disappearing into the fog. "This game has begun before the board was set," Holmes said. "He knows our routines, our habits, perhaps even the limits of my own reasoning." "That's a bold statement," I said. "Not bold, calculated, for consider, Watson, if Hargrave is correct, then this is not merely a warning. The clocks are symbolic, and like all symbols, they carry deeper intention. He did not send a bomb, he sent a whisper. He wants me to hear him ticking." Holmes returned to the table and, with surgical care, opened the back of the brass clock. Inside, the mechanism was intricate but not unfamiliar. He studied it with a magnifying glass, making quiet sounds of interest. "There's something irregular here," he muttered. "See this cog? It's been filed deliberate. Not enough to stop function, but enough to make the rhythm slightly ... wrong. Is that significant? In a machine, even a whisper of asymmetry is a message." He tilted the clock until a piece of paper, folded and yellowed, slipped out from the base. "Ah," he said softly. The second voice, he unfolded the paper. Upon it were written only 6 words, penned in tight angular script: "Time owed, time stolen, time ends." Holmes tapped the page lightly with his finger. "He fancies himself a poet, or a judge." I said. "Yes, a judge of thieves and betrayers." Holmes' voice darkened. "And he has written my sentence." He pocketed the note and stood with purpose. "Come, Watson, we are due a visit to someone who may still recall the name Grigsby from the days when it was merely whispered in courtrooms. And who might that be?" Holmes gave a rare, thin smile. "A man who forgets nothing, Inspector Tobias Grange." It had been years since I had heard that name. Grange had once been Holmes' equal in vigilance, if not in brilliance, an officer of deep principle and an unbending sense of justice. But he had resigned under mysterious circumstances following a scandal, involving a bribed witness and a missing ledger, both of which, Holmes always believed, had been orchestrated by the very same criminal mastermind we now hunted. Within the hour, we were in a cab bound for Limehouse, where Grange kept a modest office above a pawnbroker's shop. The inspector received us in silence, his thick brows furrowed, his hair whiter than I remembered. He gestured for us to sit but said nothing until Holmes placed the brass clock on the table between them. "That's his, isn't it?" Grange said at last. You remember him? Grange nodded slowly. Not by face. No one saw his face. But I remember the clocks. They started turning up when the cases went cold, when witnesses recanted, when charges vanished. One appeared in my own home after I gave evidence against a barrister. Woke to find it ticking on my nightstand. Hands stopped. Just like this one. Did you keep it? Holmes asked. Grange's lips tightened. I destroyed it. Burned it in the hearth. It screamed when it cracked. Holmes leaned in. Grange, I need everything you remember, names, dates, whispers in corridors. This man has returned, and he intends to finish whatever he began. The inspector met Holmes' eyes. Then God help us both, because Grigsby never finishes anything halfway, and he's waited too long to let you slip away now. Outside, the rain had stopped, but as we stepped back into the street, I could not shake the sensation that something unseen watched us from the alleyway across the road. Tick, 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 The sound lingered in my ears, long after the cab pulled away. Chapter 4. The Circle of the Forgotten. By the following morning, Baker Street had taken on a strange air of expectancy. Holmes stood at the window, eyes fixed on the street below, unmoving save for the idle motion of his fingers tracing circles in the condensation on the glass. The brass clock remained on the mantel, its hands still frozen at 11:47, yet its ticking, irregular and unnerving, seemed louder in the daylight than in the dark. I had barely finished preparing tea when Holmes spoke. He's reconstructing the past. Watson, I looked up from the kettle. Grigsby. Holmes nodded. He is not merely threatening us. He is drawing us back into a puzzle long buried, one built not of blood, but of silence and omission. I set the tray down. Then what is our next step? Now that we've confirmed Grigsby's methods, the symbolic clocks, the veiled threats, we must trace the full extent of his influence. He never acted alone. There were others, a circle of beneficiaries, men and women whose reputations remained intact because he made others vanish. You believe they still exist? I believe, Holmes said, that they never left. He crossed the room and opened a wooden chest beneath the bookcase, pulling from it a weathered portfolio marked Private E. Gable Archive. He laid the contents across the table: notes, transcripts, ciphered messages, and scraps of legal memoranda, all from the failed prosecution of the Minton Bonds affair. Holmes sorted through them swiftly, stopping only when he reached a page covered in faded ink. Here, he said, a list of depositions, victims, witnesses, minor players, but more importantly those who withdrew their testimony. I bent over the list. Several names were crossed out, others annotated with cryptic initials in Holmes' handwriting. One name recurs, he said. Thaddeus Pym. I frowned. The financier, the very one, a shadowy figure, never formally charged but mentioned repeatedly by those who claimed to have seen. Gable, who, we now understand, was merely Grigsby's pawn. Pym's testimony never reached court. He vanished from the city and re-emerged 3 years later with a baronetcy and a seat on the board of several rail companies. And you believe Grigsby protected him? Holmes gave a tight nod. And now, I suspect Grigsby may be calling in that protection. An hour later, we found ourselves on the steps of a grand home in Belgravia, where the polished brass nameplate still read, Sir Thaddeus Pym. Holmes rang the bell with purposeful calm. The door was answered by a tall footman who regarded us with suspicion. Sir Thaddeus is indisposed, he said with mechanical politeness. Holmes replied, Inform your master that Mr. Sherlock Holmes wishes to discuss the matter of an old acquaintance. Mr. Grigsby. The effect was immediate. The footman's face twitched, and he opened the door wider without another word. We were led into a high-ceilinged study that reeked of wealth and secrecy. Sir Thaddeus sat by the hearth, a blanket across his knees, a glass of dark sherry in his hand. His hair was grey, but his eyes remained alert, sharp and cold as cut glass. Holmes, he said after a long pause, I hoped never to see you again, and yet here we are. Holmes replied smoothly, Old clocks do not always stay silent. Pym gave a bitter chuckle. You're here about the others, I take it. Holmes remained standing. I'm here because a man we both failed to expose is now writing his own version of justice, with clocks as his pen and time as his ink. I believe you are next. At that, Pym's composure faltered. He set his sherry down with a trembling hand. I received one, he said quietly, 3 nights ago. On my desk, stopped at 11:47. Holmes glanced at me, then back at Pym. Did it tick? No, Pym whispered. It sang. Holmes' brows drew together. Pym continued, his voice growing faint. Not aloud, but in my dreams, I wake at that same time always, 11:47, hearing it chime. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see it. Did you tell anyone? I asked. Only my valet. I made him burn it, but I think he lied. I think he hid it, and now he's gone. Yesterday morning, Holmes stepped forward. Sir Thaddeus, Grigsby is not merely seeking retribution. He's executing a design that began with the Minton affair, and has only now found the stage for its final act. Pym buried his face in his hands. Then, it's true, he's returned, but I have nothing left to give. Holmes studied the man coldly. You never gave anything. That is precisely the problem. We left the house in silence. The air outside had turned colder, and the light had begun to fade once again behind a blanket of smoke and damp cloud. As we walked, Holmes spoke in a voice low and deliberate. The clocks are appearing only to those who benefited from Grigsby's But why now? Why this moment in time? To punish? I offered. Holmes shook his head. No, punishment requires judgment. This is a rehearsal. He's orchestrating a finale, and the hour of its performance, I fear, will be 11:47. We returned to Baker Street as the city's gas lamps sputtered to life. Holmes removed his coat with uncharacteristic heaviness and stood for a long time before the fire. Watson, he said at last, tomorrow we visit the final name on that list, Miriam Elwood. She too vanished from the court records, but not from my memory. If Grigsby means to complete his circle, he must pass through her. And what if he already has? Holmes glanced toward the mantel where the brass clock still ticked, soft and defiant. Then we must catch up with time, before it catches us. Chapter 5. A window in the dust. The following morning broke, sluggish and grey, as though the city itself were reluctant to wake. Holmes, however, had been up since dawn, scouring directories and council records, tracing the elusive Miriam Elwood. I found him seated cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a sprawl of maps and clippings, his dressing gown a swirl of folds in the lamplight. Success? I asked, setting down a pot of coffee. He didn't look up. She is no longer in London. She hasn't been for years. After the collapse of the Minton prosecution, she sold her father's townhouse and disappeared to the seaside Bishop's Cliff in Suffolk. Voluntary exile, of a sort, Holmes said. She was not a criminal, nor a victim. Rather, she was the hinge between the two, a young court transcriber whose transcripts vanished just before trial. Without her notes, the prosecution faltered. Scotland Yard believed she'd been bribed, and you, I believe, Holmes said, finally meeting my eyes. She was warned. He stood, brushing the floor dust from his trousers. The first train leaves Liverpool Street in 1 hour. Pack lightly. Grigsby may have gotten there before us. The journey was long and cloaked in quiet tension. Suffolk, draped in autumn gold, rolled by the windows like a forgotten dream. I watched Holmes as he read through Hargrave's statement for the third time, lips moving silently, eyes flicking back and forth as though tracking the gears of a timepiece that only he could see. We arrived in Bishop's Cliff just after noon. It was a sombre little town, perched on the edge of a grey cliffside, with sea winds that whistled through every crack and shingle. The Elwood cottage sat at the far end of the high road, a modest, ivy-draped place, worn but tidy, with a view of the ocean that stretched out like a slate sheet under the sky. Holmes knocked twice, then stepped back. A long pause. Then the door creaked open. She stood in the shadow of the frame, older than the image Holmes had once shown me, her auburn hair now streaked with grey, but her eyes, sharp and wary, had lost none of their fire. I wondered when you'd come, she said. Holmes inclined his head. You were expecting me. Not you, exactly, but someone. She led us inside without another word. The cottage was warm, fragrant with rosemary and beeswax. Books lined the shelves in uneven stacks, and a kettle murmured on the hearth. Holmes's eyes, always alert, scanned everything: the dustless mantel, the polished lock on the back door, the newspaper dated 3 days prior. I received mine last week, Miriam said suddenly, and gestured to the sitting-room table. There it stood, another clock, a sister to the one left at Baker Street, same brass casing, same fixed hands at 11:47. But unlike ours, this one was silent. I never touched it, she said. It simply appeared. On the table. I'd locked every door, and yet it found you, Holmes murmured. Miriam sank into a chair. I tried to forget. After the trial collapsed, I left London with what little I had. I told no one where I went. I thought I'd buried the whole affair. But he's unearthing us, one by one. You knew Grigsby? I asked Dot. She hesitated. Not by that name, but I knew his influence. He wasn't a man you saw. He was a silence in the room. Whenever we transcribed witness statements against the financiers, they'd change overnight, pages missing, words altered. At first I thought I'd made mistakes. Then I realized I hadn't. Holmes leaned forward. Did you ever try to expose him? I wanted to, she said softly. But then I received a note. Just one line. If the ink bleeds, so do you. The next day, the prosecutor found my transcripts unreadable, black lines drawn across every page. Holmes nodded slowly. So you vanished, and now he's calling you back. Miriam's hands trembled in her lap. Why? What does he want? To complete something, Holmes said. Something he began when he made his first clock. A symbolic gesture. Yes, but more than that. A ledger. One only he can read. A knock came then, abrupt and sharp. Miriam stiffened. Holmes held up a hand for silence. He moved to the door quietly and opened it a crack. Dot. No one stood there. Only a package, wrapped in plain brown paper, rested on the doorstep. Holmes brought it inside carefully and unwrapped it at the table. Inside was a single item, a third clock newer than the others. It surfaced unblemished, its hands set to 11:46. He stared at it for a long moment, then turned it over. Beneath, etched into the base in tiny script, were four names: Hargrave, Pym, Elwood, Holmes. No. Miriam whispered, "Why is the time different?" Holmes met my eyes. Because the hour has moved forward. The next strike comes soon. Outside, the sea crashed against the cliffs, relentless and cold. And inside, 3 clocks stood like tombstones, ticking toward a time only one man understood. Chapter 6. The hand that stopped the hour we took the next train back to London. The newly delivered clock cradled carefully in Holmes' satchel. Neither of us spoke much on the return journey. Miriam Elwood had remained behind in her cottage, reluctant to flee, but more reluctant still to be drawn further into the web Grigsby had begun spinning years before. Holmes had urged her to lock every door and bar every shutter, though I suspected he did not believe it would help. By the time we reached Baker Street, the gas lamps flickered in the growing dusk, and a pale drizzle coated the pavements in slick reflection. Inside, Holmes placed the third clock on the table beside its earlier counterpart. The two stood side by side, one brass dulled by time and corrosion, the other pristine, gleaming almost obscenely in the dim firelight. Both hands rested at the same hour now, 11:47, but only one of them ticked. "Watson," Holmes said, adjusting the magnifying lens clipped to his brow. "This clock is not merely a warning, it is a ledger, an accounting." "An accounting of what?" I asked. "Revenge." He turned the clock slowly in his hands. "Not revenge, justice, at least in the eyes of a man who believes himself beyond reproach. Look closely here." I stepped nearer. Holmes pointed to a seam at the back of the casing, nearly invisible, running along the edge like a hairline fracture. "Observe how the backplate isn't soldered or screwed it sealed. Whoever made this didn't want it opened easily." He reached for a narrow blade from his tools and slid it delicately beneath the seam. With a soft click, the back popped open. Inside was the expected clockwork, gears, coils, escapements, all finely constructed. But in the hollow space between the mechanics and the backplate was a tiny compartment. Holmes reached in with tweezers and drew forth a folded scrap of parchment, no larger than a playing card. He unfolded it. There, written in that same tight, angular hand we had now come to dread, was another short message. "When the fourth strikes, the past will close, and the truth shall chime once more." Holmes read the line twice, then laid it gently on the table beside the clocks. "I had hoped," he said quietly, "that this was a warning meant only to disorient. But now it is clear, this is a game with rules, and the fourth clock is yet to come." "The fourth," I repeated. He nodded. "For clocks, for names, 4 stories woven into a single unfinished affair. Grigsby is reconstructing the moment everything fell apart, the trial we failed to bring to justice. Only this time, he intends to finish it himself." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "And what happens when the fourth clock is placed?" Holmes' face was grave. "Then he strikes." That night, I slept only fitfully. The ticking of the clocks echoed from the sitting room like a metronome, keeping time for some approaching darkness. I awoke once near midnight and found Holmes still awake, pacing slowly by the fire, the two clocks beside him like twin jurors awaiting their sentence. By morning, another letter arrived, this time hand-delivered by a boy no older than 10. The envelope was unmarked, save for Holmes' name. He opened it, without a word. Inside was a single sheet. A friend's hand trembled. "He's not the fourth, but the hand that lied shall be." Holmes read it once, and handed it to me. "We were wrong about what?" "About the order," he said. "The clocks are not simply arriving in the order of the past's events. They are being adjusted to fit a moral calculus only Grigsby understands. Hargrave's clock ticked. So did ours. Miriam's did not. And now, someone has tampered with the balance. That interference has delayed the fourth strike, but only temporarily." He walked to the map he had pinned above the mantel, now marked with the locations of Hargrave's shop, Pym's townhouse, Elwood's cottage, and our own lodgings. "Watson, tell me, what did Pym say when we visited?" I thought back. "He said his valet burned the clock, but he doubted it," Holmes said, nodding. "He suspected the man lied." I understood. "Then the lie may have disrupted Grigsby's plan." "Exactly," Holmes replied. "The valeter one who claimed to destroy the clock may be the hand that trembled, and if so, then Grigsby will punish the lie, and the next clock won't come to us or to Pym but to the one who altered the script." Holmes turned back to the satchel and began pulling on his boots. "Come, Watson, we're going to find that valet if we can get to him before the fourth hand stops moving." We reached Mayfair shortly after midday, and Holmes lost no time. He inquired among the servants and porters of Pym Street with the same deft pressure he always employed, gentle enough to seem idle, firm enough to draw results. Within half an hour, we had a name, Francis Ketteridge, and an address, Hendon Lane, where he'd taken lodgings after being dismissed from Pym's service 2 days prior. Holmes hailed a cab at once. "Hurry, Watson. If Grigsby's clock is moving, we may already be too late." The cab rolled northward as the clouds above thickened into slate. Rain threatened again. The wheels clicked like gears beneath our feet. I couldn't help but imagine the ticking of an unseen clock following us all the way, so steady, final. And as the houses began to thin and the roads grew quieter, Holmes murmured a single line that set my heart trembling. "If we find the fourth clock, Watson, it may not be ticking." Chapter 7. The silence on Hendon Lane. The air in Hendon Lane was curiously still, muffled by the threat of rain and the hush of narrow streets that lay as if forgotten by the city beyond. The cab drew to a halt before a low-roofed lodging-house, flanked by privet hedges and a rusted gate. No children played in the lane, no birds sang. The entire scene gave off the uneasy quiet of a clock just before it chimes. Holmes disembarked first, his eyes scanning the upper windows. I followed, glancing toward the drawn curtains on the second floor. "Which room did they say?" I asked. "Front, second story," Holmes replied. "Let us hope the fourth clock hasn't arrived first." We approached the door, and Holmes rapped with a brisk rhythm. A long pause followed, then slow, dragging footsteps sounded within. The door creaked open to reveal a grey-haired landlady with a shawl tucked tightly under her chin. "Yes?" she asked, voice brittle. "We've come to see Mr. Francis Kidd. We were informed he lodges here." The woman hesitated. "Did. Haven't seen him since last night." "Was he expecting a visitor?" Holmes asked. She frowned. "No, sir. He'd kept to himself since leaving his last post. Quiet man. Didn't say much, but he left his lamp on." Holmes' brow arched slightly. "Would you permit us to look in on him?" The woman, after a reluctant pause, nodded and led us up a narrow staircase. At the top, she gestured to a closed door with peeling green paint. "He's in there, least. I think so. The key's still in the lock. I knocked this morning. No answer." Holmes stepped forward and turned the knob. The door creaked open into darkness. The air that met us was tinged with oil, rust and something far colder. We stepped inside. The room was small and spare. A cot, a chest of drawers, and a washbasin beneath a cracked mirror. The single window was curtained shut. The lamp on the table flickered, its oil long spent. But it was the object at the center of the table that drew our attention, and froze the breath in my throat. A fourth clock. This one was black. Its casing was lacquered ebony. The face unmarred, the hands just like the others pointing to 11:47, but it ticked with a sound deeper and slower than the others, as if dragging itself toward some inevitable conclusion. And next to it, slumped in the chair, sat Francis Ketteridge, lifeless, his head bowed forward. a thin stream of blood at his temple, dried into the collar of his shirt. The landlady gasped and fled the room. Holmes moved swiftly, examining the body with a surgeon's precision. No sign of struggle, no wound on the back of the head, no bruising, a single puncture above the ear, needle-thin poison. I asked, stepping closer. Perhaps, or a paralytic, but he was dead before he hit the chair. Holmes' gaze returned to the clock, and this was left after he turned it gently. No etched names this time. Instead, on the back panel, was a circle of letters for initials, evenly spaced, HPE, K, Hargrave, Pym, Elwood, Ketteredge, I said aloud. Holmes nodded grimly. The circle is now closed. I stared at the black clock. So we were wrong. Ketteredge was the fourth. No, Holmes said quietly. He was the hand that lied, remember. Not one of the original architects, but Grigsby adapted, altered the script. He made Ketteredge the fourth, not for what he had done then, but for what he failed to do now. He lied to protect Pym, I said. Precisely. And Grigsby sees silence as guilt. Holmes withdrew a small envelope tucked beneath the base of the clock. Inside was another of those chilling notes. The last witness has fallen. The hour is ready. Holmes read it once, folded it, and pocketed it. We must return at once, he said. He is done with warnings. The clock will now strike. I followed him into the hall, barely registering the landlady's sobs from below. Holmes paused on the threshold. There's more, he said suddenly. He stepped back into the room, scanned the furniture again, then moved to the window. Drawing the curtain aside, he found what he'd been looking for, scratched into the inside of the pane, almost invisible unless one looked for it, were three initials, SH. My God, I murmured. He left you a message. Holmes' face was unreadable. No, he whispered. He left a mirror. We descended the stairs quickly, Holmes moving with sharpened urgency. Outside, the sky had grown darker, despite the hour. Thunder rolled distantly over the rooftops, and I knew instinctively we were no longer investigating a mystery. We were racing it. As our cab rumbled back toward Baker Street, Holmes sat in silence, his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. His mind was moving like a timepiece wound far too tight. Holmes, I said, after a long silence, what does this mean for you? He turned his head slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching with something too weary to be called a smile. It means, Watson, he said softly, that the final clock was never for them. It was always for me. Chapter 8. The hour that waited. We reached Baker Street, just as the heavens opened. Rain fell in steady sheets, turning the cobblestones to glass. Holmes ascended the steps without a word, his coat dark with wet, his eyes focused yet distant, as if seeing not the door before him but the gears of some vast machine turning behind the world. Inside, the lamps flickered uncertainly. The sitting room was exactly as we had left it, except now. All three clocks on the mantel ticked in perfect unison. Tick, tick, tick. Holmes removed his coat, shook the rain from his sleeves, and stood motionless before the brass, golden, and silent timepieces that marked the steps of our descent into this peculiar nightmare. I expected the fourth would appear here, he said softly, but Grigsby is not so obvious. He would never let me see it arrive. It must arrive in me, in you. I asked, setting a kettle to boil. Holmes, surely you don't mean he doesn't intend merely to punish me with death? Watson, no. That would be an insult to the game he's built. Grigsby wishes to make me watch the final hour, to understand it, to fail it. He turned from the mantel to the desk, pulled out the Hargrave file once more, and unfurled the web of names. Look for players, for each fallen, either ruined or dead. Yet, in his twisted vision, I am not the judge. I am the last witness, and he means to break me. I stepped closer, trying to follow the threads of his thought. Then what is the next move? Holmes tapped the desk gently. Grigsby's final act will not be private. He'll want me to uncover it, piece by piece, with just enough time to understand and too little to prevent. A sharp knock interrupted us. Holmes turned his head slightly. He is always one step ahead. Watson, shall we see who brings the next fragment? I opened the door. A man stood on the step, soaked to the bone, his face pale and drawn. He looked as though he had not slept in days. I was told to come here, he said hoarsely. They said Mr. Holmesy could help me. I didn't know where else to go. Holmes stepped forward. Your name? Jonas Fielding, sir. I work at the old Eldermere Court Archive. I keep records, births, deaths, court proceedings. 2 nights ago, a man came looking for files. Holmes' eyes sharpened. What kind of files? Obscure ones, court documents from 20 years ago, witness testimonies, sealed transcripts. He knew exactly what to ask for, but something was wrong. He never gave his name, but when I refused him, he left this. Fielding reached into his coat and pulled out a cloth-wrapped object. Holmes took it carefully and unwrapped the final clock. Black casing, gleaming, and this one ticked. But unlike the others, this clock's hands did not sit at 11:47. They pointed to 11:48. Holmes froze. "It's begun," he said, barely above a whisper. "He started the final hour." "What does it mean?" I asked, dread creeping into my voice. "It means he's chosen his final play," Holmes said. "And it begins not with death, but with remembrance." He turned the clock over. Etched on its back were no initials, just one word. Langdale. My mind leapt. Langdale Pike. Holmes nodded, face grave. "The gossip broker. The walking scandal sheet of the West End. He traffics in secrets. Watson usually to his own gain. But if Grigsby is targeting Pike, it means he's tying up loose ends." "Then Pike may have known something about the trial," I said. "Or perhaps," Holmes added, "he helped bury it." Holmes stood suddenly and pulled on his coat once more. "We must find him before the hour chimes again." "Holmes," I said, "if the clock now reads 11:48, he nodded. "Then we have 12 minutes. We left Baker Street as the rain poured harder, our cab lurching through the narrow alleys of Soho in the theatre district. Pike kept a room above a Turkish bathhouse, where he could absorb gossip as others absorbed steam. By the time we arrived, the rain had driven most pedestrians indoors. The whole street felt deserted, as if London were holding its breath. The attendant, when prompted, hesitated at first, but the mention of Holmes' name parted his reluctance like a curtain. "Mr. Pike's upstairs. He hasn't come down all day. Left word not to be disturbed." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Then let us disturb him quickly," he said. The stairs creaked beneath our feet. Holmes knocked once at the top. No answer. He tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside. The room was thick with pipe smoke and perfume. Velvet cushions, discarded papers, and half-written letters littered the floor. Langdale Pike sat in his chair, facing the hearth, his legs crossed, his robe cinched neatly, a cup of tea at his elbow. "Pike," Holmes called. No response. Holmes approached and laid a hand on his shoulder. The man was cold. Dead. On the small table beside him sat an envelope in the same precise hand as the other notes. Holmes opened it. He gave the secrets that stilled the voice. "Now he shall be heard no more." And beneath it a final note, smaller. "2 names remain. One must break." Holmes turned to me, eyes alight. "It's a challenge now, Watson. Not merely a killing game. Grigsby means for me to confess." "Confess what?" Holmes paused, rain trickling down the window behind him. "That I could have stopped him before." He looked down at the 11:48 clock. And then he whispered, "But I wasn't ready." Chapter 9. The confession that wasn't spoken back in Baker Street. Holmes paced like a pendulum out of sync with its own mechanism. The 5th clock, Langdale Pike's now, rested silently beside the others on the mantel, its hands frozen at 11:48. The ticking had ceased, not broken, not interrupted, ceased as though its purpose had been fulfilled. Holmes, however, had not. He stood still suddenly and turned toward me. "Watson, do you recall my remark that this case began long before the clocks arrived?" "Of course," I said. "You believed Grigsby orchestrated the Minton bond collapse from the shadows." "Yes, but it goes even deeper than that. At the time, I dismissed several inconsistencies in the case. A matter of haste, if I'm to be honest. I believed I saw the larger pattern clearly, and so I overlooked a single name that kept surfacing in witness chatter." He reached into the archive drawer and withdrew a faded, creased page. "See here. This is the early statement from one of the junior clerks involved in the bonds case. He claimed to have seen a man frequenting the offices at odd hours. Not Gable, not Grigsby, but someone else entirely." He handed me the page. One name had been underlined in Holmes' spidery script. Samuel Derwent. The name was unfamiliar. Holmes must have read my face. "You won't find him in any of the official records. His name was scrubbed, redacted, or misplaced, depending on which file you examine. But Derwent existed. He was an accountant, quiet, methodical, and trusted by both sides during the Minton affair. He acted as the internal intermediary. You think he was Grigsby's pawn? Holmes shook his head. No, he was something worse, his equal. Grigsby was the architect of fear, but Derwent was the instrument. He planted the false papers, delivered the bribes, arranged the disappearances, and then ... vanished. When, 3 days before the trial collapsed, no trace since, he moved back to the map, now filled with pinholes and threads. Each of Grigsby's victims were part of the Minton Circle, directly or indirectly. But the key to understanding Grigsby's timeline is not the trial, it is the interruption of the trial. And Derwent was the one who caused it. But Pike? I asked. What did Pike know? Holmes' gaze darkened. Pike knew where Derwent went. The thought chilled me. And now that Pike is dead ... is the silence before the chime. Holmes finished. Which means the next clock, if one is coming, may not arrive to us. But from us. A knock broke the moment. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face pale. Inspector Lestrade is here. Mr. Holmes, he insists it's urgent. Holmes exchanged a glance with me before nodding. Show him in. Lestrade entered, his coat soaked, his moustache twitching in agitation. I'm not here officially, Holmes. Frankly, I'd be hanged if the Yard knew I came. But I've heard rumblings, 5 deaths in 5 days. All seemingly natural. All linked to that ancient bonds case you tangled with back in '84. You're correct, Holmes said. And it won't end unless I stop it. Lestrade looked around, his eye catching the row of clocks. He frowned. What in God's name? Tolkien's, Holmes replied. Each left behind as a signature. They mark the deaths like time-stamped obituaries. Lestrade ran a hand through his wet hair. And you think there'll be more? Holmes nodded. 1 more, at least. Possibly 2. But we've no time to dwell. I need access to anything you have on Samuel Derwent. Past inquiries, financial transactions, death certificates, anywhere issued. Lestrade hesitated. Derwent. That name hasn't crossed my desk in years. It will now, Holmes said, because Grigsby has left him for last. He intends for Derwent's downfall to answer the crimes of the past. Lestrade considered this, then muttered, I'll see what I can dig up. But be careful, Holmes. Something about this case. It doesn't feel like your usual fare. Feels like the tail end of something older. After he left, Holmes turned back to the map and stared in silence. Watson, he said at length, we've been walking a maze with moving walls. Grigsby isn't simply killing, he's reconstructing a memory, forcing me to relive the moment when I should have seen him but didn't. I stepped forward. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Holmes said slowly, that Grigsby's final victim may not be a man at all. I frowned. Then who? He turned, his face unreadable. Not who, Watson. What? Reputation, legacy, the myth of the man who sees all. He wants me to miss something vital. He wants me to fail. Suddenly, there was a sound at the door. Holmes strode forward and opened it. No one was there. Only a small envelope, soaked but sealed in wax. He opened it with a flick of the blade. Inside, a single strip of paper. When you hear the last tick, remember, you missed me once. You will miss me again. Holmes stepped back, and for the first time since the beginning of the case, I saw him falter. He sat down heavily in his chair, and the 5th clock, on the mantel, ticked once more. Only once. Then silence. Chapter 10. The room. Without dust, the ticking stopped. It was not the natural conclusion of a mechanism winding down, nor the jarring snap of a spring. It was a deliberate cessation, as though an unseen hand had gently laid a finger upon time itself, and whispered, Enough. Holmes rose without a word. I watched him cross to the mantel. He examined the 5th clock, the one taken from Langdale Pike's room, and tilted it gently in the firelight. Its hands remained fixed at 11:48. But now there was something new. A small, hairline crack beneath the glass face, one that had not been there the day before. A fracture, Holmes murmured. Not of the mechanism, but of the mask. I said nothing. I had long learned that in such moments, Holmes was speaking not to me, but to the case. He straightened, then turned to his files, withdrawing a single sheet from the pile of Minton documents and laying it beside the clock. The sheet bore a name we had only recently uttered. Samuel Derwent. He was never formally charged, Holmes said, voice quiet but taut. His name was erased through back corridors and unseen levers, but he never left. He merely stepped behind the curtain. And you believe he's still in London? I asked. Holmes nodded. Not just in London here. He wouldn't flee. Not a man like Derwent. He would hide in plain sight. A man who values systems will always seek the comfort of structure. He rifled through another folder, this one marked with property registries and business licenses. Then he stopped. Here, this address appears 3 times in 3 different forms of ownership. Shell companies, names that don't exist, but they all trace back to a single location off Bell Street, near the old city post office. He looked up. Watson, I believe we are now walking toward the clockmaker himself. We made our way there on foot, the fog gathering in thick coils around the lamplight, as though London itself sought to obscure the truth a moment longer. Bell Street was narrow and lined with shuttered storefronts and tradesmen's houses, the kind no one noticed and few remembered. At number 43, we stopped before a building that might have once been a tailor's shop, its signage long removed, its windows black with dust, but the door was clean. No cobwebs. No grime. No dust at all. Holmes rapped twice. No answer. He tried the knob. Unlocked. The air inside was still. It held the scent of machine oil, old wood, and something subtler like cloves and paper. We stepped cautiously across the threshold. The room beyond was spare, almost sterile. A single desk sat beneath a hanging lamp, and upon it, arranged with the precision of a surgeon's kit, were tools for clockwork repair. Tiny screwdrivers, magnifying loops, brass gears, springs wound tighter than nerves. But there was no sound. Holmes gestured toward a corridor at the rear, and we followed it into a chamber far more curious. The walls were lined with clocks, dozens of them, all silent, all fixed at 11:47. Each clock bore a brass plate, and on each plate names, some familiar, some foreign, some crossed out, some pristine. In the center of the room stood a chair. Upon the chair, a coat, a hat, and a single glove, carefully placed. Holmes approached slowly, as though one wrong step might shatter the illusion. He examined the nearest clock on the wall. "This one bears your name," I said, heart tightening. Holmes did not react. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled free the 5th clock. He placed it on the table, beside a small plaque etched into the wood. The plaque read, "The Witness." Beneath it, in smaller letters, "He who saw but did not stop." Holmes stared at it for a long moment. Then he turned, his voice brittle but steady. "Grigsby is not coming here. He has been here. This is not his hideout. It is his gallery." I looked around at the walls. The clocks were no longer timepieces. They were portraits, memorials to the sins of omission. Every name, a silence. Every tick, a scream no one had answered. "And yet," I said, "he left this open for us to find." "Why?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Because this was not meant to remain hidden. It was meant to echo. He wants me to walk these halls and hear the ticking in my head forever." He opened the drawers of the central desk one by one. Most were empty, until the last dot inside. A sheet of thick parchment. Holmes read it aloud. "To the man who believes in logic, you calculated too much, and considered too little. You missed Derwent once. You will miss him again. And this time, he will see you." Holmes folded the letter carefully, and slipped it into his pocket. "He's not done," I said. "No," Holmes replied. "But the clocks are. There will be no 6th. There is only what comes after." As we exited the building, the street had grown even quieter, and from somewhere distant, impossibly faint, we heard it. One final tick. Chapter 11. The man in the mirror. It was nearing midnight when we returned to Baker Street, the fog rolling in behind us like a slow tide. Holmes said nothing during the cab ride. His brow was drawn low, his hands clasped tightly around the folded note that had named him the witness. I knew this silence well, not of confusion, but of calculation. He was deep inside the puzzle now, and whatever lay at its center, it had begun to whisper truths only he could hear. Inside. The lamps burned low. Mrs. Hudson had long since retired. The 5 clocks on the mantel stood like mourners at vigil, each frozen at 11:47 or 11:48, and on the desk, untouched, lay the file that had started all of this, the failed Minton Bonds case, with its erased names, vanished statements, and courtroom collapse that had left justice gasping for breath. Holmes stood at the hearth, staring not at the clocks, but at his own reflection in the dark glass of the window. "He knows me," he said quietly, "not as a criminal knows his pursuer, not even as a rival knows his equal. Grigsby has studied me in a manner no man has dared, not to defeat me, but to reflect me." I seated myself near the fire. "You think he's patterned this case as a mirror of your method?" Holmes nodded. "Each victim not simply a thread from the past, but a deliberate reenactment of my own practices, deduction, misdirection, orchestration, and yet, he outpaces me. Every clue, every clock, arrives when I am still one step behind. And now he's left us a room of silent clocks, and a final letter that names Derwent, yet gives us no path to him. Holmes turned. Unless the letter isn't a lead, but a decoy, a misdirection meant to send me searching outward, when the answer lies inward. I frowned. You believe Grigsby wants you to confront something you've long ignored. Precisely, Holmes said, with sudden sharpness. This isn't about guilt for failing to catch him. It's about blindness, willful or otherwise. There was something in that case I refused to see, not because I lacked the intellect, but because I had no desire to see it. He returned to the desk and withdrew another paper from the archive, an original list of prosecution witnesses from the Minton affair. He traced his finger down the margin. There, he said, tapping the page, Frederick Darrow, a junior court officer who handled the transcription of the testimonies. I leaned closer. I don't recall that name. You wouldn't. His testimony was withdrawn before the trial collapsed. Claimed illness, never investigated. He flipped to another sheet. Medical records. Here, a hospital report filed the day after his withdrawal. Witness experienced acute hallucinations, paranoia, auditory delusions. He claimed a man followed him, a man who whispered time into his ear. I shivered. That sounds like Grigsby. Indeed, Holmes said. But that's not the point. The point is, what Darrow saw before the breakdown. In his original draft never submitted to the court, he mentions a name that appears nowhere else in the documents. Holmes turned the paper to show me transcripts collected from S. Derwent, notes encoded and delivered to E.g. I murmured. Edwin Gable. Holmes shook his head slowly. Not Gable. He was a mask, an actor. He moved to the shelf, retrieved a thick ledger labeled correspondence, private cases, and opened it to the earliest entries of that year. I wrote a single line in my journal the day we lost the Minton case. He pointed. He is not the one who speaks, but the one who listens and writes. Holmes looked up. That was not about Gable. That was about Derwent. My mind reeled. So Grigsby was never the man giving the orders. No, Holmes said. Grigsby was a ghost, a myth, a name passed around like a rumor. But he was there. He watched. He recorded every silence, every failure, every lie. He built this puzzle from within the shadows. He turned back to the clocks on the mantel, which means the final clue is not in the clocks. He picked up the fifth clock. Pikes examined its glass face, turned it gently. Then his hand paused. Slowly, he drew out his magnifier and examined the brass base beneath the plaque. Here, he said. I stepped closer. A small etching, hidden by tarnish, just visible beneath the nameplate, D, and beneath it, smaller still, where the first silence was made. The last chime will fall. Holmes breathed in sharply. The courtroom, not where the case ended, where it never began. The Minton hearing room, I realized. Exactly, Holmes said. Derwent has been reconstructing that courtroom in pieces. Each victim, a seat that once stood empty. Each clock, a silent witness. And now he wants me there, alone, at the hour it all should have begun. He checked his pocket watch. We have less than 2 hours until midnight. I rose. Do you think he'll be there? He will be, Holmes said, because the trial was never for them. It was always for me. He picked up the fifth clock and placed it gently back beside the others. I must stand where I once failed to look, he said, and with that, we stepped once more into the night toward the courtroom, the silence, and the man who had waited, ticking, all these years. Chapter 12. The trial that never spoke. The horses' hooves echoed like gavel strikes as our cab cut through the wet silence of London's night. We passed under gaslight flickers and across streets so empty they might have belonged to another century. The city felt thinner now, like some essential weight had shifted, drawn away from rooftops and pavements to gather inside a single waiting room. Holmes was silent beside me. His brow creased in contemplation as he held the folded note from Pike's clock, the one that whispered of the first silence. I knew the look in his eyes. He was not merely hunting Derwent, he was walking into the very moment he had long resisted, the moment he had missed. The courthouse stood dark and closed upon our arrival, a monolith of soot-streaked stone and forgotten authority. Holmes produced a slender key from his coat, one he had used in years past for private consultations with magistrates. The side door opened with a reluctant groan, revealing hallways cloaked in shadow and stillness. We moved quickly. our footsteps muffled by the thick runner along the corridor. Holmes led us without hesitation to courtroom B, an older chamber, long unused, where the Minton proceedings had been scheduled before their collapse. He paused outside the double doors, fingers brushing the brass handle. "This," he said, "is where it all fell quiet." He pushed open the door. Inside, the courtroom remained preserved in dust and shadow, like a playhouse abandoned mid-performance. Wooden benches lined the gallery. The judge's seat loomed at the far end beneath a tarnished crest. The witness box sat empty. Except for one thing. At the center of the prosecutor's table stood a single black clock. It was different from the others, larger, more ornate. Its brass hands pointed not to 11:47, but to 11:59. The second hand was moving. Holmes approached it. Slowly. "There is something ceremonial about this," he murmured. "A final performance. He means to finish the story. One tick remains." "Do you believe he's here?" I asked, voice low. "He's been here from the beginning." Holmes turned to the judge's bench, and that's when we saw him. A figure rose from the shadows behind the seat quietly, slowly, clothed in black, neither hunched nor strong, but composed with the poise of someone who had waited too long to rush anything now. His face was narrow, drawn, clean-shaven. His eyes gleamed behind wire spectacles, and in his left hand he held no weapon, only a worn notebook. "Derwent Holmes," said calmly. Darman gave a small, dry smile. "Mr. Holmes." At last, I stepped forward instinctively, but Holmes raised a hand, halting me. Derwent moved to the rail of the judge's dais. "I wondered how long it would take for you to see it. Not the puzzle, not the pattern, the silence. That was always your flaw, Holmes. You noticed the extraordinary but never the void left behind by the ordinary." Holmes met his gaze. "You wanted to be caught. I wanted to be seen," Derwent replied. "For once. Do you know what it's like to be the man who records everyone else's importance, but has never remembered himself? I sat in that courtroom every day while men like Pym and Pike sold justice by the ounce. And you, brilliant Holmes, you looked past me as if I were furniture. You falsified testimony," Holmes said quietly. "You delivered lies to the court. You aided in the disappearance of a key witness. I wrote the script. Mr. Holmes, I knew the players, the rhythm, the betrayals. And when the curtain fell, I was left behind in the wings." He gestured to the clock. "So I made my own theater." Holmes' voice hardened. "You killed them." Derwent nodded. "No jury would ever convict them now. Time has eroded the proof. But I preserved it. In brass and glass, I gave each of them a chance to reflect, to hear the ticking of what they'd stolen." A minute of silence before the end. He looked down at the notebook in his hand. "You were always meant to be last. The one who missed me, who thought deduction enough, who never once asked who transcribed the truth beneath your brilliance." There was no anger in his voice, only sorrow. The sorrow of a man whose vengeance had long outlived the satisfaction it promised. Holmes stepped forward. "Then this is your confession. It is my verdict." Placed the notebook on the bench. And then he pressed a button on the side of the clock. It ticked once more, then stopped. 11 o'clock. The hour passed. Silence. And then Derwent simply sat down in the judge's chair. Holmes approached slowly, opening the notebook. Its pages were filled, not with threats, but transcripts, accords of conversations, arguments, betrayals, every case that had collapsed, every injustice that had gone unpunished, all annotated in his precise, silent hand. "I will call Lestrade," I said, stepping back. Holmes closed the book. "No," he said. "He will come to us." I looked to Derwent. He said nothing more. His eyes stared ahead, not with defiance, but with the weariness of a man who had finally spoken after a lifetime of being unheard. As we left the courtroom, the clocks in Baker Street, silent for days, began to chime. Not in anger, not in warning, but in release. The trial had ended, not with a sentence, but with a witness finally heard. Chapter 13. The Echo That Stayed. Morning, after the confrontation at the courthouse, dawned grey and unwilling. A drizzle tapped lightly on the window panes of Baker Street, and the soot-stained rooftops of London loomed in silence. Inside, the clocks on the mantel, 5 in all, remained still. Not broken, not wound, not needed anymore. Holmes had not slept. He sat at the desk in his shirt-sleeves, the flickering gaslight casting long shadows over the notebook retrieved from Derwent. Its pages had grown more fragile through the night, the ink almost vibrating beneath Holmes' long slender fingers as he flipped, paused, then read again. He did not write this for vengeance, Holmes said at last. I looked up from the chair by the fire. What then? Holmes answered without looking at me. He wrote it for remembrance. Every page is an obituary not of lives lost, but of truths buried. Dozens of names, Watson, cases that failed, evidence ignored, statements edited under pressure or fear. Derwent was more than a witness. He was a historian of failure. I stood and crossed the room. And now he's handed that history to you. Holmes nodded. He left it not for the courts, but for the one person who missed him when it mattered. He closed the notebook carefully. When Lestrade arrived last night, I said, he was staggered by the scene. A man alone in a courtroom, a ring of clocks, and not a weapon in sight. What did he make of it? Holmes gave a humorless smile. He called it a symbolic breakdown, suggested Derwent had lived too long in his own head. Do you agree? I think, Holmes said, that Derwent simply waited too long to speak, and when the world refused to listen, he turned his silence into a language of its own. He walked to the mantel, studied the clocks for a long moment, then took the fifth pike's hand, opened its rear casing. I never noticed this before, he murmured. He pulled a slip of paper from a narrow compartment beneath the movement. It was sealed in wax and bore only a single mark, a stylized D. He opened it. Inside was a note, brief and precise. You will not publish this. You will not parade me in court. You will not solve me for applause. You will remember me. I exhaled slowly. Then he knew. He always knew, Holmes replied. Every step he left for me to follow, he knew I would reach too late, and that was the point. He set the note beside the notebook and crossed to the window. You must understand, Watson, he said. This case was never meant to test my skill. It was designed to fracture my certainty. Grigsby, if he ever existed at all, was only a phantom. Derwent created a myth in order to hide within it, and in doing so, he showed me something I've long resisted. I waited. Holmes turned from the window. That justice can be missed, not through failure of mind, but through absence of attention to the small, to the silent, to the man without name or voice. And when that happens, no brilliance can repair the harm. The words hung in the room like smoke. After a pause I said, "And what will you do with the notebook?" "I shall keep it," he replied, "but I will not quote from it. Not in public, not in the Strand, not in your writings." You think that's what he feared? No, Holmes said quietly. I think that's what he hoped for, that I would finally learn to leave something unsolved. He crossed to the hearth, stoked the fire, and took a long breath. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Did you notice what time it is?" I glanced at the clock on the wall. Precisely 11:47. Holmes nodded. The clocks all stopped at that hour. The trial was scheduled for noon, but it never began. Derwent chose 11:47 because that's when the silence started. And now, he let the words fade. I stepped to the mantel, picked up one of the clocks, and listened. No ticking, but I fancied I could still hear something else. A memory, a pause, a held breath, an echo. That evening, Holmes sat by the fire, pipe in hand, gaze distant. He did not speak of the case again, not that night, nor for many nights after. The clocks were returned to their crates and stored in the back of the cupboard, beneath old monographs and violin scores. The notebook remained on the highest shelf, untouched, unopened, as though he feared that if he read it again, the silence might resume. And so ended the affair of the clocks, a case, not of riddles, but of regret. And in its wake, Holmes, the man who had solved everything, finally understood what it meant to carry the one thing that could never be deduced. A moment missed, forever ticking, just once, then gone. Chapter 14. The fingerprint in the dust. It was several days before Holmes stirred again in earnest. During that interval, he moved like a man living inside a riddle only he could hear, slow, listening for a chime that had already rung. I gave him space, knowing his mind needed time to recover from Derwent's intricate confrontation, not with the law, but with conscience. And then, on a foggy Thursday afternoon, something shifted. He stood from his armchair with the sudden energy I had seen only in the early stages of the most urgent cases, and crossed to the shelf without a word. From beneath a volume of Lassion's Day Deductions, he withdrew the slim, black notebook Derwent had left behind. "You said you wouldn't publish it," I said cautiously. "And I will not," Holmes replied. But Derwent was meticulous. He wasn't just recounting failures, he was keeping records. There may be something buried in here not meant for reflection. but for redirection, he turned to the final quarter of the pages, his eyes scanning with a speed honed over years of examining telegrams, court transcripts, and the endless detritus of urban deceit, and then his hands stilled. "Here," he said, "a list, separated from the others." He turned the book so I could see at the top of the page. Written in Derwent's careful hand were the words, "Unopened accounts for the final clock." Beneath, a list of 5 names. 4 were crossed out. One was not. I read it aloud. Nathaniel Cray. Holmes nodded. A name that appeared nowhere in the Minton affair. No court record, no public scandal. And yet, Derwent set him aside for the final clock. Why? He turned and paced briefly. If the clocks were confessions, then Cray must represent the last omission, the one Derwent never exposed during the others, perhaps because it led beyond the trial, beyond his purpose. I stepped closer. What do we know about him? Very little, but that can be remedied. Within the hour, Holmes had summoned a dossier from his private archives, one of those deep dust-bound ledgers built through favors and inquiries made in years long past. Inside was a thin packet marked Cray, N. Ministry clerk retired. Holmes opened it. Nathaniel Cray, formerly of the Ministry of Industry, retired early. No family, lived alone near the dock. Quiet reputation, no known criminal ties. No ties, I said slowly, or no visible ones. Holmes gave me a tight smile. Exactly, the kind of man no one remembers until it's too late. He turned to the final note in Derwent's file. It read, "Cray holds the true face of Grigsby, the mask beneath all others. He will not run. He believes he is forgotten. That is the one thing he shares with me." Holmes looked up. Derwent never knew Grigsby fully, because Grigsby was Cray or became him. Then why wait? I asked, why not include him among the others? Because Derwent didn't want closure. He wanted recognition. Cray, meanwhile, wanted only oblivion. He closed the notebook, and yet here we are. At the threshold of the final turn, we arrived at Cray's residence just before dusk. It was a red brick row house on a silent cul-de-sac near the Limehouse Basin. Remarkable, almost invisible among the grime of forgotten industry and faded signage. But Holmes approached it with the same wariness he had shown in Derwent's chamber of clocks. He knocked, no answer. Then, with his gloved fingers, he pushed the door gently. Unlocked. Inside. The house was silent. Dust hovered in the air like sleep interrupted. We stepped into the front room, and there it was. On the mantel, the 6th clock, not brass, not black, but glass transparent, delicate, utterly still. Its hands were motionless. Holmes approached it, examining the base. There was no plaque, no note, nothing but the shape of a fingerprint, recent, pressed into the dust beneath the clock stand. Holmes leaned in. He was here, very recently. He turned. "Search the house. I want everything, letters, records, bank stubs. We must know what Cray left behind." I moved through the rooms. All were sparsely furnished, bare of color or warmth. In the study, I found a locked drawer. Forcing it open, I discovered a single envelope addressed to Sherlock Holmes. I returned to the front room and handed it to him. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, handwritten in a precise, steady hand. "Mr. Holmes, I watched you once before. I knew you'd reach this place eventually. I am the ghost behind the ghost. Grigsby was never real, and I was never seen. Derwent tried to make you remember. I intend for you to forget. That is my final request. Let silence win. N.C. beneath the signature, a postscript. The 6th clock will never tick. It has already ended." Holmes set the letter down and stared at the clock, and for a long while, we said nothing. Then, Holmes whispered, "It's over. Not solved. Not won, but ended." "Cray's alive," I said. "You believe that?" "Yes," Holmes replied. "But we'll never find him. He has become what Derwent feared, invisible by design." Outside, the sky dimmed further. Fog rolled in from the river, swallowing the streetlight one lamp at a time, and in the room behind us, the 6th clock stood silent, clear, untouched, like time. That had learned how not to leave a trace. Chapter 15. The clock that was never wound for. Days after our visit to Nathaniel Cray's abandoned home, Holmes walked as one does at the edge of sleep-awake. He made no comment on the letter, nor on the 6th clock, which now stood on the windowsill of Baker Street, untouched and unmoving. It was, in every sense, an artifact of finality. No ticking, no plaque, no echo, It did not demand to be solved. It simply existed, like a door no longer meant to open. Lestrade came by once. Having reviewed the report, Holmes reluctantly submitted a sparse, almost clinical summary of the affair. The inspector had shaken his head as he read it. No names you can charge. No proof that holds, and the main suspect has vanished into the fog. You sure you want to close the book on this one, Holmes? Holmes hadn't looked up from the fire. The book was never open, and with that, Lestrade had quietly left. That evening, I sat with Holmes once more in the glow of the hearth, watching the shadows lengthen along the walls. I couldn't keep from glancing at the glass clock, transparent and ominously still. It reminded me not of time passing, but of time withheld. What if Cray returns? I asked. He won't, Holmes said. You sound certain. I am, Holmes murmured. Men like Cray vanish because they wish to become what they've always been. He crafted Grigsby as a ghost to guide Derwent's rage. He needed someone passionate, someone who would believe the myth and carry the burden. And when Derwent was done, Cray disappeared into the shadow of his own invention. But to what end? I asked. Why all the clocks, the theatre, the meticulous structure? Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Because Cray understood something most criminals do not. That memory is the sharpest weapon of all. He didn't want to destroy us. He wanted to make us remember. Not just him, but every moment we overlooked a name, every time we trusted the law to sort truth from silence. The clocks weren't warnings. They were mirrors. I sat back, letting his words settle. And the 6th clock. Holmes turned his eyes toward the mantel, where the other 5 clocks had been boxed away, sealed and stored in a far corner of his archive. The 6th clock, he said, was never meant to tick. Cray left it for us, not as a final strike, but as a gesture, an unanswered question. What happens when the silence wins? He stood and crossed to the window, where the glass clock glinted faintly in the city's waning light. I have chased villains who burned cities and poisoned kings, he said, but this was a quiet thing, a crime of omission, built upon the quiet corners of our world. It challenged not just my logic, but my vision, and for once, Watson, truly I did not see in time. His voice was neither bitter nor mournful, only ... honest. You blame yourself, I said. Holmes turned. No, but I understand myself better. That is, perhaps, the greater punishment. He reached out and gently turned the 6th clock in his hand, examining it from each angle. Look here, he said suddenly, pointing to the base. I leaned in. At first, I saw nothing. Then, under the right light, a faint etching became visible, nearly microscopic. We vanish not when we die, but when we are never seen. It was unsigned. I exhaled slowly. That's Cray's legacy. Then, vanishing by choice. Holmes nodded. And leaving just enough behind that we cannot forget him. He returned the clock to its place, then crossed to the fire and sat once more, his frame lean and still in the deep chair. Tell me, Watson, he said after a time, will you write about this one? I hesitated. I had intended to, I said, but now, I wonder if silence would be more appropriate. Holmes gave a rare smile. Perhaps that is the final puzzle, he said. To know when the story should end. Without a final word, the fire crackled softly. Outside, the bells of St. George's tolled the hour, and in our sitting room, 6 clocks remained still, not broken, not unwound, just ... Done. Chapter 16. The silence. Between strikes it was 3 weeks before Holmes spoke the name Cray again. In that span, life in Baker Street resumed its quiet rhythm. The early winter fog began to settle along the Thames like a woolen shawl, and the familiar thrum of horse-hooves and lamplighters returned to the streets. Scotland Yard sent word of lesser cases, bank frauds, petty thefts, suspicious wills, and Holmes attended to them all with professional ease. Yet the 6th clock remained. It sat, ever unchanged, upon the sill in our sitting room, catching the wan sunlight like a relic of some forgotten church. It did not tick. It never had. But Holmes refused to put it away. When I pressed him, he merely said, because it reminds me of what. He didn't say, but I suspected he meant everything. On the first Wednesday of December, as I returned from an afternoon stroll through Regent's Park, I found Holmes at his desk, his violin lying across his lap, untouched, and a single envelope before him. Its seal had already been broken. He looked up as I entered. It's from Lestrade, he said. I removed my coat, noting the tension in his tone. Another case? Not exactly. They've found him. I froze. Cray. Holmes nodded. Or rather, They found his coat, floating in the lee near Blackwall Reach, in the inner breast pocket, his ministry identification, his keys, and one of Derwent's transcripts. Was there a body? No, Holmes said, and therein lies the truth. I sat slowly across from him. You don't believe he's dead? Holmes lifted the violin but did not raise the bow. No, Cray staged his death, in the only way that befits a man who has lived his life as an absence. He left behind the garments of identity, the name, the history, the record, but not himself. He has evaporated into the dust between what we know and what we only think we know. Then what was the point? I asked. All the clocks, the letters, the trial that never happened, what did it change? Holmes was quiet for a long time. Then he said, nothing. He plucked a single note on the violin strings, indistant, unresolved. And yet, everything. He reached into the drawer beside him and removed Derwent's notebook. It was worn now at the corners, dog-eared from quiet midnight readings. He opened to a page near the end. Derwent's final entries, Holmes said, were not about the others. They were about me. Observations, frustrations, notes on cases I solved, and moments I failed to see. He was not seeking revenge, Watson. He was offering a kind of education. I frowned. And Cray, Holmes said slowly, used Derwent's passion as a conductor, uses a violinist's bow drawing music from his grief. But once the music ended, Cray disappeared. He never wanted to be seen, only to be heard once. He closed the notebook with gentle finality. I've spent years imagining that truth is always there, waiting to be uncovered. But Cray and Derwent showed me a harder lesson, that some truths hide not behind lies, but behind neglect. I studied my friend, this man of steel and smoke, deduction and silence. For the first time in years, I saw in him something I had not seen since the earliest days of our work. Together out, not in his methods, but in the very machinery of justice that he had spent his life maintaining. Holmes, I said, do you believe they won? He turned to the window, where the glass clock sat still as stone. No, he said, but neither did I. And then, as if reaching a decision long in the making, he stood and crossed the room. He lifted the 6th clock in both hands and turned it to face us. There, etched faintly into the underside of the base, previously unnoticed, even by Holmes, was a final inscription: tick only when forgotten, stop only when seen. He read it aloud, then whispered, it was never meant to move. We stood in silence, the fire crackling low, the sounds of the street muffled by heavy drapes and heavier thoughts. In that room, filled with the echoes of solved crimes and unsolved silences, something settled, not resolution, not vindication, but understanding. Later that night, Holmes placed the clock back into its box. He wrapped it in velvet and locked it in the cabinet beneath his archive files, beside the original Minton documents and the discarded ledger of Derwent's clocks. As he turned the key, he looked at me and said, let us not speak of this again, Watson. Not in your journals, not in your memoirs. Let it remain an absence. I nodded, and though I honored that promise in public, I record it here only now, not as a tale of brilliance or justice, but of the single case that taught Sherlock Holmes the most uncharacteristic lesson of all, that silence, too, can be deliberate, and that sometimes the most eloquent clock is the one that was never wound. Chapter 17. The minutes that never lived. Winter deepened. The frost came in fine patterns across the windows of Baker Street, drawing veins of silver in the corners of every pane. Our fireplace burned low through the evenings, casting long shadows that seemed to carry the memory of every case Holmes had ever pursued. But for all his past victories, his triumphs over rogues, murderers, blackmailers, and kings, it was the silence of the 6th clock that stayed with him, and with me. We did not speak of Cray again, not directly, but his presence, or the echo of it, lingered in Holmes's every movement. He read the morning papers more carefully than usual. He paused longer over court notices and obituaries. He watched the faces of anonymous passers-by with renewed scrutiny, as if expecting to glimpse a man who had erased himself entirely. And then, in late December, something changed. It was a Thursday. I remember it because I had just returned from my practice, where an influenza outbreak had kept me uncommonly busy. As I entered our sitting room, I found Holmes at the desk. The black leather-bound notebook of Derwent opened before him again, but this time he was not reading it. He was writing in it. I approached quietly. His pen scratched across the page, methodical, deliberate. I glimpsed the heading he had written, Addendum, SH, below that. He had begun a list. Cases where silence, not evidence, revealed the truth. The first entry was dated 3 years prior. The second, 6 names I recognized, but never connected in this way. Holmes was cataloguing not crimes solved, but moments missed, gaps in testimony, statements never spoken, witnesses never heard. "Holmes," I said gently, "what is this?" He did not look up. Derwent kept a record of omissions. I'm continuing it. Why? He capped the pen and finally met my gaze. "Because if Cray's legacy is absence," he said, "then mine must be remembrance." It was the closest I had ever seen. Holmes come to acknowledging failure, and yet it was not defeat in his voice. It was purpose, a quiet one, but unshakable. "Cray wrote a system of clocks," he continued, "each one a reminder of what we chose not to see. I cannot undo what was missed, but I can refuse to miss it again." He closed the notebook and set it gently on the shelf above his monographs. "Between crimes of the Crown and on human evidence, not hidden, not elevated, just placed, as one might place a stone over a grave." The following day brought snow. The city dulled beneath its hush, and business at the yard slowed. Lestrade visited us briefly, bearing a single sheet of newsprint. "A curious one," he said. "This turned up in a delivery at the Times, no byline, no author, just this." He laid the clipping on the table. Holmes picked it up. It was a short letter, printed in full, without commentary. "To the one who never spoke, you were heard. Your silence rang louder than any bell, and your shadow touched even those who swore they could see all. The clocks will never chime again, not because time has ended, but because someone, at last, is listening." Lestrade shook his head. "Poetic nonsense, if you ask me. The editors are baffled. No return address, no signature, no one at the presses admits to receiving it." He paused. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about this?" Holmes didn't respond directly. He folded the clipping once, placed it inside his coat pocket, and poured Lestrade a brandy. That evening, as the city fell into stillness once more, Holmes and I sat before the fire. The 6 clock remained locked away, and the others had been forgotten by everyone but us. I looked across the room, uncertain. "Holmes," I said at last, "do you still believe Cray is alive?" He did not answer at once. Instead, he leaned forward and, with a match, lit his pipe. The smoke curled upward, vanishing into the lamplit haze. Then softly, "I believe Cray has become exactly what he intended to be, a reminder, a question mark, the second hand that never moved." And with that, he smiled, faint, thin, but genuine. "For all his crimes," he added, "he succeeded at one thing I cannot deny." "What's that?" "He taught me to look, not just at what is, but at what isn't." Outside, the wind tapped softly at the glass. Time moved on, and in the hollow space between chimes, in the room where silence had once ruled, Sherlock Holmes remained still. Listening. FOREVERMORE. Chapter 18. The final strike spring returned with a whisper. The cold that had settled over Baker Street for months began to retreat, leaving in its place the scent of thawing earth and the sharp, faint perfume of smoke from reopened chimneys. London stirred once more, unaware that a war of silence had come and gone in its midstand, that its loudest victor had never spoken. Holmes, for his part, had regained his energy. He took cases, again discreet ones, involving thefts of rare manuscripts and vanishing financiers. But even I could see something had changed, not in his brilliance, which remained undimmed, but in the way he now approached each mystery. He listened more, he watched longer, and above all, he questioned what wasn't said, not merely what was shown. And then, on a crisp April morning, a small, cream-colored parcel arrived at 2-1B with no name, no C, only a single mark on the wax, a dot inside a circle. The symbol was unmistakable, the 6th clocksmaker. Holmes took the parcel, silently, and opened it with the care of a man unwrapping a memory. Inside was no mechanism, no threat, no scrap of paper, only a brass key and a folded map. He laid them on the table and studied the map for several minutes. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes tapped the page. "It's the layout of Derwent's courtroom, as it was before the renovations. But look, this is a variant sketch, not from city records. It includes a sealed passage beneath the floor, a bailiff's storage crawlspace." He turned to me. "Derwent left us this, but not as a clue, as a choice, to open the final chamber," Holmes said, "to decide whether this mystery must have a last revelation or remain, as Cray intended, unfinished." We went that evening. The court had long since been closed for repairs, but Holmes still held influence in unexpected corners. A few quiet inquiries, a borrowed key, and we stood once more in the chamber of silence. The walls were bare now, the clocks removed, the judge's bench stripped of its velvet, but the floor remained unchanged. Holmes knelt at the center and found the panel with the faint carving, the same dot within a circle. He inserted the brass key and turned it. With a soft click, the panel lifted. Inside was a narrow space, no taller than a crawl, dark and close. Holmes reached into the void and withdrew a box, a wooden case, sealed in dust and silence. He opened it. Inside lay a single sheet of vellum, a seal from the Ministry of Industry, and a final letter, this one written not in Derwent's careful print, but in a stronger, older hand. Holmes read it aloud. To the one who searched, there is no identity called Grigsby. There was never a man, only the echo of decisions made in locked rooms. I was clerk, then ghost, then rumor. Derwent was my conscience. I, his shadow. The clocks were not tools of guilt. They were reminders that time does not forgive what men forget. You may close this box, or you may leave it open. That is your burden now. Holmes folded the letter slowly. Then he placed it back inside the box, resealed the lid, and returned it to the hollow beneath the floor. He locked the panel and rose. You're leaving it? I asked, my voice low. Yes, Holmes replied, because the truth it holds is not mine, nor is it yours. It belongs to a moment that passed and those who failed to hear it. He turned to the doorway. Let others find it, perhaps one day, when they're ready. As we stepped into the hallway, the gaslight flickered against the worn brass sconces. Holmes looked over his shoulder once more, not with hesitation, but acknowledgement. I used to believe, he said, that every mystery had a solution, that the world was merely a matter of patience and reason. And now, he said, I know some mysteries are meant not to be solved, but carried. We returned to Baker Street, just as the street lamps lit. The city glowed beneath a rising moon, oblivious to the quiet revolutions unfolding in its deepest corners. Holmes lit his pipe and stood by the window, and I, watching him from across the room, finally understood the true cost of genius. Not triumph, but memory. The sixth clock never ticked, but it did not need to, because Sherlock Holmes had heard it anyway.